So if you want to track down Michigan's most sought-after, like highly prized culinary delicacy, you'd probably assume you should be looking in this lush, green, perfectly pristine forest valley,
Oh,
right?
totally. That's what everyone thinks.
Yeah, but actually, if you want the ultimate jackpot, you should be looking for a landscape that recently burned completely to the ground.
Right, which is just, it's the ultimate paradox of foraging. You're out there looking for life, vibrant, highly valuable life, but you're doing it in the immediate aftermath of total destruction.
And that bizarre contradiction is exactly what we are untangling today. So welcome to the deep dive.
Glad to be here.
Our mission for this session is to take the mystery out of foraging and basically turn you into a knowledgeable, responsible Morel mushroom hunter.
Yeah.
And we're pulling all our intel straight from the official guidance provided by the Michigan Department of Natural Resources.
The DNR, yeah. Which is honestly the perfect starting point. I mean, the DNR manages millions of acres of public land in Michigan. They know these ecological rhythms better than anyone. And, Michigan is actually home to thousands of wild mushroom species, which sounds incredibly intimidating if you're just starting out.
Oh, yeah, completely.
Yeah.
Like, where do you even begin?
Exactly. But morels have this really beautiful advantage. They look so distinct, like these strange, little brain-textured cones, basically.
Yeah, they look like little aliens.
They do, and because of that, they are widely considered the safest, easiest entry point for beginners. There's really nothing else that looks quite like them.
So if you've ever been curious about finding your own food in the woods, but you've been, paralyzed by the fear of picking something toxic.
Which is a very valid fear, by the way.
Totally valid.
Yeah.
But this is your green light. We are keeping it practical and accessible. But before you even think about stepping into the tree line, we have to talk about the calendar.
Right. The timing is everything.
Because the DNR points out that the Morel fruiting window is shockingly wide. I mean, they call May Morel month, but the actual season stretches from late April all the way to mid-June.
Yeah, that's almost 2 full months. And that wide window exists because we are dealing with this massive geographical gradient in Michigan.
Well, yeah, just looking at a map of Michigan, you've got the southern border touching Ohio and Indiana, and then you travel hundreds of miles north.
You cross the bridge.
Right, across the bridge, deep into the Upper Peninsula. So I have to assume the soil down south is thawing out and warming up weeks, maybe a full month, before the snow even finishes melting up north.
That is the exact mechanism driving the timeline. I mean, spring doesn't just switch on all at once. It creeps northward at a very measurable pace.
Okay, so the southern forests wake up first.
Exactly. So that late April timeline is heavily skewed toward those southern counties. As the days get longer and the sun angle changes, through May and into June, you get this invisible wave of biological activation.
Just slowly traveling up the state.
Right, moving toward the Mackinac Bridge and beyond.
Which totally dispels this huge myth I always hear, that you have to plan some massive multi-day expedition to the deep northern woods to find morels.
Oh, no, not at all.
Yeah, the DNR explicitly states that some of the most productive picking happens in the southern half of the state.
The southern woods are incredibly dense with the right organic matter. If you live downstate, you don't need to burn a tank of gas driving north. You just need to, be paying close attention to your local environment earlier in the season.
And that local environment is heavily dictated by the weather. The DNR guidance makes it super clear that morels are just stubbornly sensitive to the spring climate.
Oh, incredibly sensitive.
It's not just about the calendar hitting May 1st. If the spring is cold and dry, the DNR says you could see an almost total failure of the mushroom crop for that entire year.
Yeah, a complete wipeout.
So it's like the soil temperature acts as the alarm clock, but the spring rain has to be the fuel that actually builds the mushroom.
That is a phenomenal way to visualize it.
Yeah.
To really grasp why they are so sensitive to the weather, we kind of have to look at what a mushroom actually is.
Awesome.
The morel that you see popping out of the leaf litter, that's just the fruit. It's like the apple on the tree. The actual living organism, the tree, in this analogy, is the mycelium.
And the mycelium is entirely underground.
Entirely underground. And it is massive. I mean, we are talking about a subterranean network of microscopic fungal threads.
Like a huge web.
Exactly. If you took a single handful of healthy forest soil and stretched out all the microscopic mycelial threads hidden inside it, they could stretch for miles.
Miles. From one handful of dirt.
from just one handful, and this network lives under the forest floor all year for years or even decades, just quietly surviving.
So the organism's always there, even in the years when the mushrooms don't pop up.
Always there. But sending up a mushroom takes an enormous amount of physical energy and biological resources.
Right.
The mycelium relies on turgor pressure.
Turgor pressure, what's that?
It's essentially hydraulic water pressure. It uses this pressure to literally inflate the mushroom and push it up through the heavy dirt.
Oh, wow. So it's literally pumping them up with water.
Precisely. So if the soil hasn't reached that critical warm temperature to signal that winter is over, or if there just isn't enough groundwater to physically pump up the cellular structure of the mushroom,
It just doesn't happen.
right, the network makes a very calculated survival decision. It stays dormant. It decides that the energy cost of reproducing this year is just too high.
It basically hits the snooze button and waits for next spring.
Yep, exactly.
That makes tracking the weather feel much more like an active sport. You aren't just looking at the forecast to see if you need a raincoat.
Right.
You're trying to calculate the soil hydration and the ground temperature.
You are learning to read the landscape's history over the last 3 weeks. You're tracking consecutive days of nighttime temperatures staying above 50 degrees, followed by, a heavy soaking rain.
That's the trigger.
That is the trigger. If you aren't watching the sky, looking at the ground is honestly a waste of time.
Okay, so let's set the ideal scene then. We've been tracking the weather.
Mm-hmm.
We had a mild winter, a warm April, and a solid 3 days of soaking spring rain.
Perfect conditions.
The alarm clock has gone off, the fuel's in the ground, the mycelium is ready. Now we need to know what specific patch of dirt to stand on. And this brings us back to that counterintuitive fact from the beginning.
The fire.
Yes, we are looking for fire.
This is where foraging crosses over into forest ecology. The DNR actually advises hunters to seek out large recent burn sites in forested areas.
But they don't just say any forest. They specifically highlight areas where jack pine, white pine, or red pine once grew.
Yes, the pines are key.
And they explicitly warn foragers to stay away from grassy or non-forest areas, even if they burned. So let me try to connect the dots here.
Go for it.
If a fire sweeps through a dense pine forest, it's burning away the thick canopy above and incinerating all the dead brush on the forest floor. That means suddenly the bare soil is exposed to direct, intense spring sunlight. Is this primarily just a massive temperature trigger for the fungus?
Right on the money. You are drastically changing the thermal dynamics of the soil. Without the shade of the pine needles, the ground heats up incredibly fast.
Makes sense.
But it's a chemical change, too. When those pines burn, thousands of pounds of wood are converted into ash. That ash is dumped directly onto the soil, which acts like a massive, instantaneous influx of nutrients.
Oh, like fertilizer.
Exactly. It wildly alters the pH level of the dirt, making it highly alkaline in a very short period.
So the fungus wakes up to a sudden flood of sunlight, a spike in heat, and a massive dose of chemical fertilizer.
It does, but there is an even deeper biological drama playing out under the soil, and this explains why the DNR specifies those pine forests.
Okay, what's the trauma?
The mycelium of these specific morels doesn't just live in the dirt. It lives in a symbiotic relationship with the roots of those living pine trees. It's called a mycorrhizal network.
Wait, so the fungus and the living tree are like actively interacting?
They're actively trading with each other.
Wow.
Yeah. The pine tree has leaves, needles, so it can photosynthesize sunlight into sugars. The fungus can't do that, but the fungus has that massive, miles-long microscopic web we talked about.
So it's pulling up water.
Water, and it is incredible at mining the soil for deep minerals. See, they trade, the fungus gives the tree minerals, and the tree feeds the fungus sugar.
That is fascinating. So what happens when a massive crown fire rips through and kills the pine tree?
The sugar tap is instantly, violently shut off. The host tree is dead.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the mycelium, which has been happily trading with this tree for maybe a decade, suddenly senses that its food source is gone and its immediate environment has been destroyed.
It's cut off.
Completely cut off. The organism essentially goes into a state of biological panic. It realizes the current location is no longer viable for long-term survival.
So it hits the emergency eject button.
Exactly. It triggers a massive panic fruiting. It pushes up thousands of morel mushrooms simultaneously, aggressively using whatever energy it has left.
Just to get the spores out.
Right. So those mushrooms can release billions of spores into the wind. The goal is to cast those spores miles away, hoping they land in a healthy, unburned forest where they can start a new network.
That is absolute wild. When you pick a morel in a burn site, you are essentially intercepting an ecological escape pod.
I love that phrasing. Yes, an escape pod.
That completely changes how I view these little mushrooms. But practically speaking, this presents a massive logistical hurdle for just the casual hiker.
It really does.
I mean, how on earth is someone supposed to know where a lightning strike or a controlled burn took out a specific stand of jack pines 2 or 3 years ago? We can't just drive down dirt roads looking for charred stumps.
Which is precisely why the DNR created the My Morels map. It completely bridges the gap between complex forestry data and the citizen forager.
Yeah, let's talk about this map because the technology is fascinating. It's an interactive digital map layer you can access online, right?
Yep, completely free online.
It overlays the entire state of Michigan, and it highlights the large burn areas from the past couple of years.
Yeah.
And the coolest part is that it integrates ground cover data.
That's the game changer.
Right. So you don't just see a burn scar. You can zoom in and see if that fire happened in a conifer forest or pines, or if it happened in a wetland or an open grassy field.
Because, as we established, a burned grassy field is completely useless to you. Grass doesn't have that deep symbiotic root relationship with the morel mycelium.
Right.
You need to cross-reference the fire data with the timber data. The map does all that math for you.
It's an incredibly powerful tool. But I have to point out the giant red flag, the DNR, slaps right on the front page of this app.
The disclaimer.
Yes. They explicitly publish a disclaimer noting that this map cannot guarantee the presence of morels at these locations,
Oh.
which feels a bit funny.
It does sound like a bit of a letdown.
Yeah, they build this high-tech satellite tracking system for mushrooms, point you to a specific coordinate, and then say, by the way, there might be absolutely nothing there. It's essentially a map of dead trees, not a map of mushrooms.
That's very true. It requires a shift in mindset. You cannot view the My Morels app as a treasure map where X marks a guaranteed prize. It is a tool for layering probabilities.
Shrinking the haystack.
Exactly that. Michigan has millions of acres of public forest. If you just wander into the woods blindly, your statistical odds of crossing paths with a fruiting morel are astronomically low.
Just a needle in a haystack.
Right. What the DNR is doing with this map is allowing you to filter out the 99% of the forest that is currently biologically quiet.
Because even if a pine forest burned, and the soil chemistry changed, and the fungus is in a state of panic, if the spring is too dry, and that hydraulic water pressure isn't there, the mushrooms still won't physically inflate.
You've got it. The map provides the location data, but the weather provides the activation energy.
I see.
By combining the historical fire data, the specific pine tree identification, and your own tracking of the recent rainfall and temperature, you are stacking every possible variable in your favor.
You are bypassing the sterile ground and spending your Saturday walking through a high-percentage zone.
It turns foraging from a game of pure luck into an exercise in applied data.
Okay, so let's assume the data pays off. You tracked the rain, you pulled up the My Morels map, you found a 2-year-old jack pine burn scar, and boom.
Jackpot.
You step over a log and see a beautiful cluster of wild morels. But before you pull out a knife and a mesh bag, we have to talk about the boundaries, because the DNR is incredibly strict about the legal and ethical framework of harvesting from public land.
And these rules exist because public lands endure an immense amount of pressure. When you have millions of residents with access to the same woods, a lack of boundaries leads to the tragedy of the commons.
Where a resource is just stripped bare.
Right, completely depleted.
The very first rule the DNR lays out is financial. Morels gathered on public land are strictly for personal use. They absolutely, unequivocally cannot be sold.
It removes the commercial incentive. The moment you allow people to sell wild forage from public land, you invite commercial operations.
People treating it like a business.
Exactly. People would enter the woods not for a hobby or a personal meal, but with industrial harvesting goals, literally raking the forest floor to maximize profit.
Yeah.
The state forests are held in trust for the public's enjoyment, not for private commercial exploitation.
That makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
But the DNR rules get a little more nuanced when it comes to what you can actually take.
They do.
They note that alongside mushrooms, you can gather other wild foods on public land. Things like wild nuts, berries, and native tree fruits.
Right.
But they draw a very sharp, heavy line right there. If you want to harvest whole plants, like digging up a wild fern or a wild ramp, or if you want to tap a maple tree for sap, you can only do that on private property.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
completely illegal on public land.
That distinction is the cornerstone of sustainable foraging.
And I'm looking at that distinction and I'm thinking about what we discussed earlier regarding the underground mycelium network.
Yeah.
The DNR says taking a mushroom is fine, but taking a wild ramp, a type of wild onion where you dig up the bulb, is illegal. Is that rule entirely based on how the organism regenerates?
You nailed it. It is all about the impact on the core organism. Think about the physical act of harvesting a mushroom. Because the mycelial network is miles long and buried safely underground, snapping off the fruiting body above ground is essentially the biological equivalent of trimming a fingernail or cutting a single strand of hair.
The organism doesn't even register the loss.
It doesn't harm the network in the slightest. In fact, by carrying the mushroom through the woods in a mesh bag, you are actually helping the organism by spreading its spores as you walk.
Oh, that's cool. So you're like a delivery mechanism.
Exactly. The same logic applies to picking a blackberry. You take the fruit, but the thorny bush remains rooted, alive, and ready to produce more berries next season.
But when you take a shovel and dig up a whole plant,
You are amputating the organism from the ecosystem. A wild ramp takes years to mature from a seed to a harvestable bulb. When you dig it up, you have permanently deleted that specific genetic line from that square foot of
you
forest.
cannot regrow.
No. If 1,000 foragers each dug up 10 plants, an entire valley could be wiped out in a single weekend.
Wow. And tapping a maple tree for sap, while it doesn't instantly kill the tree, involves drilling a physical hole into the living wood. You are creating a wound, and you are literally draining the energetic lifeblood, the sugars that the tree needs to survive.
Right. It requires intensive, long-term stewardship to tap trees without causing lasting damage or introducing disease. The DNR simply cannot manage that level of individual impact across millions of acres of public land.
Yeah, that would be impossible.
So the rules are beautifully straightforward. You can harvest the renewable surplus, the fruits and the mushrooms, but you must leave the regenerative engine of the forest completely intact.
It's a brilliant philosophy.
Yeah.
You are invited to be a participant in the ecosystem, to enjoy the surplus, but you are forbidden from being a destructive force.
Beautifully said.
So let's pull all of this incredibly cool science and DNR guidance into a tight, actionable toolkit. If you are listening to this and you're feeling the urge to get out into the Michigan woods this spring, here is your beginner's mental checklist before you lace up your boots.
Step 1 is always the sky and the calendar.
You're looking at late April through mid-June, tracking that slow wave of spring moving from south to north. But primarily, you're waiting for the alarm clock and the fuel.
Right, you need days of warm soil temperatures and soaking spring rains to create that turgor pressure. Cold and dry means the fungus stays asleep.
Okay, step 2 is the map.
Boot up the DNR's My Morel's application. Don't wander blindly.
Look for the data intersections, right? You want recent large-scale burn sites, and you must verify that the ground cover was pine jack, white, or red.
And avoid the burned grassy fields.
Right. You are looking for the places where the fungal network lost its symbiotic tree partners and is hitting the biological panic button.
And step 3, check your ethics.
Personal use only. No commercial selling from public lands. Remember the fingernail rule. You can trim the hair by taking a mushroom or a berry, but you cannot amputate the organism.
Leave the whole plants in the dirt and do not tap the trees on public land.
If you follow those 3 steps, you are drastically increasing your odds of a successful hunt.
Absolutely. But honestly, even if you come out of the woods with an empty bag,
Yeah.
you are still walking away with something incredibly valuable.
How so?
The DNR notes that morels are just the introductory chapter to thousands of species in the state. And once you start paying attention to them, your entire perception of the outdoors shifts.
It totally rewires how you look at a walk in the woods.
It really does. You stop seeing a static background of green trees and brown dirt. You start seeing the invisible, highly active connections. You realize that a lightning strike 2 years ago, a rainstorm last Tuesday, the pH of the ash and the microscopic web beneath your boots are all engaged in this silent, complex conversation.
And the mushroom is just a single word in that conversation.
Exactly. It leaves you with a fascinating question to ponder the next time you step off the pavement. Once you train your eyes to see the history of the soil and the invisible biological triggers that produce a single morel, you really have to wonder, well, actually, you have to ask yourself, what other secret, massive, interconnected ecosystems are you walking right over the top of every single day, completely blind to their existence?
Wow. That is the perfect thought to leave you with. This process is so much bigger than just looking for a free meal. The map is breathing, the ecosystem is constantly reacting, and the forest is quietly communicating its history if you just know how to listen. So track the weather, check the burn data, respect the public land, get out there to see what the woods are trying to show you.